Welcome back to the Flex Diet Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Mike T. Nelson. On the podcast, we talk about all things to increase performance, add more muscle, improve body comp, and do it all without destroying your health in a flexible framework. Huge thanks to everyone who enrolled in the Physiologic Flexibility Certification. Super stoked for all of you to get into the material there. Really appreciate it. And related to glucose that we talk about in a big dive in the PhysFlex cert, which is closed now. It closed on Monday night. I wanted to talk about continuous glucose monitors. And so we've got a whole podcast here with Catherine from Nutrisense talking about just that, continuous glucose monitors. So Catherine is a registered dietitian, nutritionist, and she currently works as a nutrition manager at Nutrisense, which is one of the companies that provides continuous glucose monitoring. And they allow you to talk to a professional about what you're actually seeing. So you actually get good interpretation of your data because it can be a little bit confusing. She's worked with thousands of clients and has reviewed over 750,000 hours of glucose data in recommendation of different meals and follow-ups. She has a master's in nutrition education from Columbia University also, and done her undergraduate work at the University of Pennsylvania. So in this podcast, we talk about how she got into continuous glucose monitoring. Based on all of the data that she's seen, what trends does she notice? The dreaded grapes, and are they good or bad, air quotes here, for your glucose. More data equals more awareness. So one of the tricks I do with online clients and what I teach in the Flex Diet Mentorship is it's not worth arguing with clients. You probably need to get their awareness first. And this is where I think data becomes incredibly powerful. The dynamics between insulin and glucose, and I'll link to a podcast I did with my buddy, Dr. Tommy Wood, about insulin and glucose. You can go on a deep dive on that. And then how should you set up your continuous glucose monitor? What kind of experiments should you do? So I've been working off and on with continuous glucose monitors, probably going on, is it 4 years now? Maybe it's even over that. First with Dr. Ben House in Costa Rica, where we threw a bunch of continuous glucose monitors on people and had them eat all sorts of crazy things for down there, pineapple, rice cakes, etc. And what was really shocking to me is there was a huge difference from one person to the next, even when we tried to control the same amount of carbohydrate. These are a bunch of lifting dude bros who were like super healthy and didn't really have any pathologies going on. So I've had a glucose monitor on myself. I even stuck one on my wife's right arm and her left arm just to compare them to make sure they were semi-accurate. So shout out to Krista from the Points Retreat for originally hooking me up with those many years ago. So it's been super interesting to kind of play with them over the years. Last comment here before we get into the podcast. There is, in essence, a wrong way of doing this too. I'm not a big fan of using data, whether it's HRV, continuous glucose monitors, ketone levels, whatever, into scaring people, the bejesus out of them into doing things. You definitely want to show them where they can improve and what they're doing well. But just like looking at your sleep data from Aura or your HRV from iAthlete or whatever, the goal is to use the data to become more resilient and more healthy, not to feel like you have to live in this box and never color outside the lines. So again, that's my biased opinion. I think some people get a little bit too neurotic about their data, and that also can be a negative. So, but overall, I think awareness in most cases is definitely going to be a good thing. Enjoy this podcast on continuous glucose monitors with Catherine from Nutrisense.
Personally, I don't care for puppets much. I don't find them believable.
I don't believe you!
Oh!
Oh,
Hey, how are you?
let me make sure this is all plugged in here. Let
Sure.
me switch the
Sorry.
microphone over. It's not seeing this one yet. Do, do, do. All right. Okay. 99% of the time, this works.
That's okay.
There we go. It sounds better on the end.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Does it sound all right on your end?
Totally.
Yep, okay. There. All right. Let me just close a few other windows, make sure my computer doesn't yell at me, and we're good to go. Always seems to happen like right in the middle of something. How are you doing today?
Oh my gosh, I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. Good. And where are you located again?
I'm in Connecticut.
Oh, okay. I assume it's nice weather out there.
Yeah, we got some hot days. It's pretty steamy right now. It feels like July, as it should.
Oh, that's good. Nothing wrong with that.
How about you? Where are you located?
In the Twin Cities, Minnesota.
Nice. I have a close friend who has a family farm in Minnesota. So I've spent a lot of time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
part of Minnesota?
The southeast corner, like kind
Okay.
of near Mankato. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Nice.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very
It's beautiful
cool.
out there. I feel like it's just people in my neck of the woods don't know that area, and it's
Oh,
special.
yes, I like it. Okay, so that's all good to go. Great. And you're good for an hour, you said, correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. So I'll record a little intro, outro afterwards. So we'll have all your info, your name and bio and all that stuff. So we can just do a short pause and get right into it if that works for you.
Totally. Sounds great.
Awesome. Cool. And welcome back to the Flex Diet Podcast. Yeah, Catherine, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here and talk to you.
So today we're talking about continuous glucose monitors, which have been around for some time, but I think they're becoming more and more popular now. And how did you get into working with continuous glucose monitors? Usually most people have a interesting story related to it.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's super. I would say I'll start with this is a second career for me.
Ah, okay.
I used to work in finance in New York City in the hedge fund space. That was all my undergrad work. And I really felt like after about 8 years, 10 years, I was like, this is not where I feel like my passion lies. It's not what I want to be doing in 20 years. So I was lucky enough. I went back to school. I got my master's in nutrition education. And then from there, I'm a registered dietitian. As you meet other registered dietitians, you start to hear their stories. And I remember one of them once said to me, you will wear many hats in this career. You will not just have one job, and had a bunch of different jobs after going to school. And then it was during the pandemic, I had a private practice. I was seeing a lot of people locally. And during the pandemic, I said, gosh, I really miss working with people. And I miss working collaboratively and outside of the box. When you're a dietitian, you're trained in those very traditional clinical areas, right? You have your low sodium diet in the hospital, you have your low carbohydrate diets in the hospital. You're not really allowed to think differently outside of that. And so I hunted around and I came upon Nutrisense, which is the company that I work for right now. And they are providing CGMs, continuous glucose monitors, to a non-diabetic population, although we do take type 2 diabetic people. And it's really a preventative health effort. And that just got me fired up, right? Because that's really where my passion lies as a dietitian, is helping people prevent those chronic diseases that can occur later in life, because it takes decades to get there and you need to start early. So that's how I found them. I've been working for Nutrisense for a little over 2 years now, and it's been incredible.
Awesome. If you don't mind speaking about it, for yourself, what was most illuminating out of the course of just your, I don't know, personal health story? And then the second part to that question is what
trends have you seen, especially given your background looking, I would assume, at a whole bunch of data in a different domain, but now you can maybe apply those same skills to your new domain here?
Yeah. Personally, I've always had GI issues, just gut health stuff. And that is a real kind of Wild West frontier right now with the research. There's a lot of research, there might not be as many conclusions. And so I was always looking for what could be causing this, what could be doing all those kinds of things. And I had no idea how much glucose can be impacting not my immune system and then therefore my gut health. And what I loved about learning about using the continuous glucose monitor was I compared to basically like a window inside your gut, a window inside your body, really, to see what's going on. Who wouldn't want to see what's happening in your body real time, right? You can see what's going on with exercise. You can see what's going on with food, with stress, with sleep. So I was really intrigued by the live, continuous feedback data that I was getting from it. So I could really test out the different foods that I was having to see what kind of responses I was getting. That's me personally. And then, oh my gosh, yes, in terms of hours of data, I've looked at hundreds of thousands of hours of data, thousands of members I've helped counsel throughout my time at Nutrisense. And that's been really fascinating to see how certain people coming to us, say, with a general goal of longevity, or I'm training for a race or something like that, they have these aha moments where things that they thought were really fantastic and working well in their life maybe aren't. There's a way to better optimize it, right? Or helping someone realize the stress, how that's impacting their life. It's these aha moments for people that have been so rewarding.
Cool. Have you seen any, I guess, general trends related to specific types of foods? Because one of my pet peeves with continuous glucose monitors is not the monitor itself or the companies or anything. It's the oversimplification of one guru gets a device, puts it on their arm, and all of a sudden, oh, I had grapes, and look at my blood glucose, it went bonkers. Therefore, grapes are bad for everyone. I wouldn't really jump to that conclusion, but I get it that people listening want, this is a good food, this is a bad food. Oh, it was bad for this person, so I'm going to avoid this too. And it just seems like if that's the mode of operandi, you can find anyone, and next thing you're just eating, I don't know, grass-fed steak or something, right? You end up doing a carnivore approach because you get so scared off of like any other foods versus using a device, like trying to get your own data. How do you feel? How do you perform? What is best for you as an individual instead of applying somebody else's an individual data to themselves?
You hit the nail on the head. That's exactly it. I could not agree more. We say a lot of this N equals one, that this device, this data, this is your own experiment, right? When you read any type of scientific journal article, study, there's always the N equals, that's the population in the study. So N equals 5,000, N equals 10,000, depending on the size of the study. This is a study of one. This is your study. And so grapes for you are different than grapes for me. Oatmeal for me is different than oatmeal for you. Not only is it just body composition, right? Depends on your muscle mass versus my muscle mass. It depends on my stress level versus your stress level. What are you pairing it with? There's all these nuanced factors that's why we really find this kind of data to be so specific and really helpful, because it's not just watching someone on Instagram say, oh gosh, I had grapes and look what happened. Therefore, exactly, we're only eating steak from now on. It's okay. So I love having this food. I love watermelon, or I love to go out on a date night with my spouse. How can I have that in the best way possible? Because I don't want to give up my lifestyle. I don't want to not eat carbohydrates. We're not anti-carbohydrates, right? It's just about finding a way to optimize it.
Have you seen any kind of general trends of foods that tend to be more problematic, or is it really individual? And the reason I ask is if someone were to start testing, what would be a spectrum to start from? Okay, yeah, these are things that generally are good, and then these things can get a little bit more squirrely on the other end.
Yeah. I think there are a lot of surprise foods that people don't realize can spike their glucose. So something like sushi or oatmeal, quinoa, things that people are like, this is so healthy. I've been having it for years. They don't realize necessarily what's going on and then really what's happening afterwards. So what you're seeing in the glucose monitor data, I don't know how familiar your audience is with it, is that you're seeing a graph and you're seeing it real time. So what's interesting is what we look at in terms of a meal is the 2 hours after you start eating. And we offer a meal score in our app so you can rate yourself as to how you're doing. And there's lots of metrics involved in how that score comes out. But we want to see what happens after that. Do you have a crash? Is your glucose spiking super high and then crashing down? Or are you doing things to mitigate that spike to make you have more gentle ups and downs, gentle sort of ocean waves is what I compare it to. So a lot of times, yes, someone will have a bunch of grapes and then they sit down, they're at their desk and they're not moving around. And so absolutely their glucose will spike, right? But if they're having those same grapes after chicken salad or tuna salad or something like that, where they've had protein, maybe some healthy fats, some avocados before that, you'll have a very different response. Same if you're breaking your fast, right? So breaking your fast could be a 12-hour fast. It could be dinner to breakfast or up in whatever your schedule is. But anytime you're breaking a fast, if you're hitting it with carbohydrates, if you're hitting it with some orange juice first thing in the morning, something like that, can really raise your glucose super high and come crashing down afterwards. So in terms of those trends, what we see is it really depends on what you're eating, when you're eating, and in what order you're eating it.
Got it. Yeah, I think the context is what people forget about all the time. Like they did, even, I had various clients do the same experiment, and we've played around a lot with continuous glucose monitors. God, probably going back almost 4 years now. And it's very easy for a client to look at something and be like, well, just picking on grapes of, oh, I had grapes for breakfast and, oh, look at this. It spiked super high and then dropped. It's, what else did you have? I didn't have anything else. It was the only thing I had. Okay. Oh, it was first thing in the morning. Did you train yesterday? Were you high stress? And even just movement throughout the day or post training. A lot of times I've taken clients and had them test the same food after they got done doing 60-minute strength training session. And they're completely bewildered at that point because they're like, well, I thought this was bad, but now it's okay. Just to illustrate that it's not always necessarily the food itself, it's the context. When did you do it? Timing, movement, all these other things can play into everything too.
And absolutely to your point with strength training is the amount of muscle that you have is the amount of storage space. The more muscle you have, the more storage space you have for glucose, right? And so your body's ability to handle a glucose load of carbohydrates in grapes can be very different depending on a woman with much less muscle mass than someone who's a guy who's working out all the time and has a lot more room for storage. So that's also a real eye opener for a lot of people. And that's why we really try and encourage all sorts of movement, not just cardio, because a lot of women just think, oh, I'll be on the elliptical for an hour and everything will be great. And then as they get older, it's not really working in the same way that it used to. So we really promote making sure that they are maintaining, and if they can, build that lean body mass, not only for good glucose control, but as for all sorts of functional movement, functional health, not falling, not breaking anything, all that.
And for numbers, what do you consider for, let's say, just a fasting blood glucose number, that kind of a range you guys would consider as good or a target range? And then what would you consider for sort of a spike post meal, and about what levels would you want to see that come back down to?
Yeah. So we start out with our default ranges and our default, when you open our app, we have a time within range band. And that's just the default. That's the general, what we expect most people not coming to us, perhaps with the type 2 diabetes diagnosis, where that bandwidth and those metrics might be elevated at the time. So our fasting glucose range that we like to see is 70 to 90 in the mornings. And then our time within range is 70 to 140. So we like to see a meal spike to stay underneath that 140. But it's all adjustable. And so we have some people that say, I absolutely don't want to go over 120. Some people are like, I don't want to go over 100. And sometimes people are coming to us with their glucose wildly dysfunctional. They've got a dysfunctional metabolic health and they've got dysregulated glucose metabolism. And so we don't want to discourage anyone. We just up that band and we really work with them towards their goals wherever they are.
Yeah, I like that. In my bias for normal range, it's a 80 to 90. I think you could go a little bit lower as long as you're not symptomatic. I think it's fine. Peaks, I would agree, 120 to 140. It just seems like people get more, as they monitor stuff, it seems like there's a on the fringe aspect, a driven desire to show your numbers are better than your neighbors. And sometimes I think I had one person who didn't want to ever go above 100. And they were a normal, healthy person, like no issues. And I'm like, I don't know. I think if we gave you a whole bunch of carbohydrates, seeing a spike to 120 or 130, as long as you can clear it on the backside, I'm not really that worried about it. I think there's been an over extrapolation of some of the data from type 2 diabetics showing that, yeah, if your glucose is definitely in the high range and it's staying up there for periods of time, like you're definitely going to be in a world of hurt. But it's not this nice linear response where if you can get it below 100 all the time, you're going to be better than someone who hits 120. Physiology doesn't work in that nice, neat linear response.
Exactly. And glucose is not the enemy, right? The body really thrives on it. The brain particularly loves it. Not that I'm against ketones, but what we love to see is that the ability to flex in and out of your different fuel sources, right? Nothing wrong with getting into ketosis, nothing wrong with staying in ketosis for whatever you want, however long you want. But we like to see that then you can have some carbohydrates, add them, whole grain carbohydrates into your diet, and your body can handle it. What we see sometimes with people that have been on a ketogenic diet or very low carb for a very long time is that sometimes you get a little bit of physiologic insulin resistance. So it's short term. Yeah, you might be familiar with it. So it's short term. The body should get right back to being able to use glucose again pretty efficiently, but it can be a couple days of readjusting to that fuel source. But we want to see people that can flex in and out of both of them, because long term can be really hard to follow a ketogenic diet for the next 40 years, whatever it is. Very few people, I would say, can handle that kind of dietary restriction for such a long period of time. Therefore, we want to make sure that our members are able to live a healthy lifestyle and to have those periods where you might have some higher carbohydrates and some lower carbohydrates.
Yeah, and obviously that's my bias with metabolic flexibility, right? So can you handle higher periods of carbohydrates? Can you handle lower periods of carbohydrates, right? You want to be able to handle both fuel sources, fats and carbohydrates. And one of the very first times we did this was with I think at the time, the reader only could look at a week's worth of data. So only one person in our little group had a reader. So we had a local nurse. She's, hey, do you mind if you guys run this experiment? Yes, this will be great. We had 6 people that did it. We came over, had this little party, stuck all the little sensors on us. And she's like, if it's okay with everyone, can we get back together in 2 weeks? We'll collect all the data at once and just compare notes. We're like, yeah, it's great. And so during that time, we didn't see any of the data. We didn't know what was going on. We're doing all of our food logs and everything. So we get together and she has all the individual reports for us, and we're going around the table. And the person I knew at that time was very strict keto. And the nurse is, hey, what happened on this day? I see your blood glucose was high. And she had, I don't know, some like 3 crackers or something like that. It wasn't a high amount of carbohydrates. And she was all very upset about it because she was like, I'm supposed to be doing this healthy diet and I just had this small amount of carbohydrates and now my glucose is super high and it happened again on this other day. And I was trying to explain to her, like, what's going on. It's probably not a negative thing. It'll probably change over a few days. It's a non-pathological insulin resistance at the muscle level, blah, 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 blah. And she got mad and she's, oh, what did you have for breakfast that morning? And I'm like, let's see. Oh, this is the day I was seeing what levels of glucose I could get to. So I had oatmeal and 3 cookies. And she, what were your levels? I'm like, 123. She's, oh, I hate you. You suck. You horrible human. I'm just like, but I generally exercise a lot. I generally have higher amounts of carbohydrates. I'm more used to it. So I thought it was very interesting that even as you go more extreme, you can see these kind of temporary changes. And that also it's very hard for people to not get hung up on their values of what you get on a score is kind of part of your identity of who you are at the same time too.
Absolutely. And listen, to be fair, this can be a triggering thing for people.
Oh, yeah.
This, just as any tracker, wearable, calorie counting track can be a triggering thing for some people and can motivate you in an unhealthy way. But what we like to see is that it can help liberate some people's diet so that some people that have been so strict can say, gosh, maybe I can work on this and incorporate some carbohydrates on a slow basis so that I don't have this reaction when I do eat some. And then you get those physiological feelings after. I wonder how she felt after that big cracker spike, right? Or if she crashed down and felt crummy afterwards. We feel like it can be liberating for some people, but it can be triggering for others. So you just have to be pretty careful. And with the scores, we talk a lot about calibration. People get very upset. What is my baseline? I need to know what my baseline is. And all of these devices have a bit of margin of error built into them. We really emphasize trends, right? We want to see, that's really the point of the continuous glucose monitor, right? You can just take a finger stick every day and get your fasting glucose, right? But what we want to see is the trends over time. That's way more important. And frankly, the glycemic variability is a bigger predictor of insulin resistance over time. And that's very hard to measure that glucose variability with finger sticks throughout the day. So that's why we really try and emphasize people looking at more of that holistic picture as opposed to getting focused on the one number.
Yeah. And I believe you guys are using, is it the Libre Freestyle? Is that what you're using, correct?
Yeah.
And have you seen pretty good agreement between that's actually measuring the interstitial level of glucose compared to blood glucose? So it's not the exact same thing, but we did a bunch of experiments for a while where I freaking hate needles. So a buddy of mine were like seeing how often we could tolerate finger pricking ourselves and measuring blood glucose and then looking at the CGM. And they weren't always exactly the same, but it did appear that the trends were following in the same direction. And then later on, I also took and put a sensor on my wife's left deltoid, and then we waited 10 minutes to put one on her. And so we had the two graphs done at different times, and we superimposed them just to make sure the trends were kind of lining up. And you did see a little bit of different numbers between them, but in general, the trends were in good agreement too. So it's, again, I agree that it's looking at the variability and the trends over time. And I think people easily get hung up on one number or, it went from 80 to 75. It's who cares? It's like you're just so far down in the weeds at that point, especially on the low end of these things. It's
Yeah, no, I agree. Well, I think what's so rewarding is seeing those people that do have those higher swings and they're able to lower them down, right? Or the people that do have very high fasting glucose or something like that, that they're able to bring it down over the course of a couple of weeks, of a couple months. How about of your people that you've been helping with this? What have been the time frames that you've seen with the most improvement in their glucose values? Has it been 3 months? Has it been shorter than that? Weeks?
we've generally seen, we don't work with a lot of pathologic people, but through the one nurse, she had a couple of people that were frank type 2 diabetics that were under supervision of her physician. And there's one guy who, man, he was pinging like 300, 250, just really high. And what was fascinating is that he was very non-compliant with everything. But once he saw the actual data, it was almost like he couldn't really run from it anymore. And so once he actually started doing stuff, like he saw huge improvements, even in just 4 weeks. So I've seen some with people that tend to fluctuate up a little bit higher. Some people we've seen big changes in just a couple of weeks. Might be modifying when they took the food in, sleep, stress. We do a lot of monitoring of heart rate variability, looking at stress levels. And usually just trying to figure out like what is the main leverage point for them? Are they just not moving enough? Do they need to make another food choice? Are they need more sleep? Can they manage their stress? And it's pretty crazy. I think I'd be interested in what you guys have seen, but even in a couple of weeks, like you can see measurable changes in a fair amount of people, which is more responsive than what I would have predicted overall. Because I think we have this thing, and I tend to fall in this category too, that it took you many years to get to where you're at. It's going to take you many years to get out. But it appears that physiology is very asymmetry orientated towards your physiology wants to actually get better. It wants to be more efficient, because we've seen people borderline type 2 diabetics who know how long it took them to get there. And in some cases, 4 to 6 months, like they look like a normal, healthy person, blood tests, everything else. To me, that's like fascinating. Your body can take so much abuse for years, but yet you start doing things better. And within a few months, you can actually get back to a much higher level. It doesn't take you years upon years.
Agreed. Absolutely. The body wants to perform efficient. It's like the body wants to ungunk the gears, right?
Yeah.
And if you can clear some stuff out, and the cellular turnover in your body is pretty rapid. And so as soon as you can start producing and the mitochondria is running and everything's working better, it snowballs. It's that flywheel effect, right? And then all of a sudden you're sleeping better. And then all of a sudden you're sleeping better. You're more active and you're making health. Like all of that snowballs into a much healthier lifestyle. Yeah.
What are some of the bigger changes you guys have seen on your end, since you obviously have looking at way more data than I see?
Yeah, it's the same thing. We get people coming in with, I'm on metformin, I'm on XYZ. We don't take type 2 diabetics that are on insulin, but on any number of blood pressure medications, cholesterol medications, within 3 months, they've lowered their dosages. Within 6 months, they maybe are off medications. I had a member who was a diagnosed type 2 diabetic, couldn't perform at his job. He had to take some leave from his job, wasn't able to do it. And then maybe it was a full year, I think, just because of like scheduling and hearings and stuff like that. He was back at his job. He basically had not reversed it, but had gotten back down to the levels where they then allowed him to perform, which I thought was pretty incredible. And again, I don't know how long it took him to get there, but it certainly wasn't 1 year. It was much longer than that, 6 to 9 months, probably, when he was actually, his labs were showing no A1C, elevated A1C, or elevated fasting glucose. So it's pretty incredible. I do think it depends on the commitment and the motivation of the person. Some people really jump in and are like, I'm ready for a change. I'm going to make this happen. It just can take longer for some people to really institute those behavior changes, because that's what you're looking for, right? You're looking for someone to really commit to this for the rest of their life so that they can mitigate that chronic disease on the long term. And if it doesn't stick, if you're not going to do it, you got to find something else.
What would be some, for people listening, like leverage points you would look at? So let's say you're looking at someone's data. They're generally pretty decent, but they have excursions that kind of go up to 150, 160, and they hang out there for quite a while. It takes them 2-3+ hours to get back down to baseline. What would you be thinking as things they could try to improve that then?
Lots of different ways to attack it. Depends if they're logging their meals at the app. If not, that's the first question, right? What did you eat?
Sure.
What's the fat composition? We see a fat and alcohol can really impact the body's recovery. That recovery is your return back to baseline. So depending on the composition of your meal, when we see really high fat carbohydrate foods like a fettuccine Alfredo or a lot of pizza, something like that, the fat will delay the body's ability to process the carbohydrate. So that's when we see those higher swings. And it doesn't even have to be that high, but it's that slow recovery. They're not coming back down. The body isn't able to clear it because it's processing the fat. The second thing is when there's alcohol involved. So the body will make the priority of processing the alcohol first. So a lot of times at dinner, we'll see, I didn't come back down for a long time. And we talk about, what did you have anything to drink with your dinner? What was going on there? Because that can delay. And even the fat, you can see double and triple spikes later on as the body is able to process some glucose, then it has to stop, then it's able to process some glucose, and then it stops. So we talk about the composition of the meal. And then we talk about movement after the meal. That's a huge, easy, free hack that someone can do to help manage their glucose and get that recovery back down. Because if you're eating at your desk and then you're just sitting there taking phone calls, maybe you're stressed out, whatever it is, you're not moving, what's your body going to do with all that incoming energy? Same for dinner. If you're eating late at night, you get home, you spend a stressful day, you just cram something in really quick, and then you watch Netflix and you roll into bed, your body is doing nothing, right? Your body's doing nothing with that incoming energy. So those are two things that we talk about first and foremost. What did you eat? What was the composition of your meal? And did you do any kind of movement afterwards? It is incredible to see the drop in your glucose from a walk after. It's so simple. It's so ridiculous. And then when people see it, they're like, oh my gosh, I had no idea. Also, just eating a little bit earlier in the day. As you guys might already know, we're more sensitive to insulin earlier in the day. There's a huge movement towards chrononutrition, eating more in terms of our circadian rhythms during daylight hours, which goes against the intermittent fasting trend of eating later in the day. But a lot of people have found that if they just move that last meal earlier in the day, the body's able to process it better, more efficiently. So we talk about all that kind of stuff. Are you having a dessert late at night? What if you switch that dessert to earlier in the day, maybe an afternoon dessert, and then your body can handle that glucose load better, just physiologically?
Yeah, I think the walking and movement after, just for most people is a huge thing. I know Stan Efferdine has talked a lot about this when I've talked to him about it. And I think we tend to forget that just muscle contraction in and of itself from simply walking independent of insulin, can pull blood glucose directly out of the bloodstream and what's called non-insulin mediated uptake. And there's been some super interesting studies, some older work in dogs that's showing that at lower to moderate levels, like most of where your glucose is coming from might be related to that mechanism. So I think a lot of times, we think of just formal exercise, like you got to go train really hard and you're using more glycogen then, which is true. But I think we forget about the just low intensity activities can be super beneficial.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Coupled with the strength training. But yeah, I always tell people, I had this really lame motto that my husband always rolls his eyes at. I say, after you eat, move your feet. And he's like,
Oh, I like that.
I got to get like a trademark and put it on a t-shirt. But it's incredibly powerful. You look at people that live in urban areas, people that live in Europe, it's very common to eat and then take a walk or to walk home from whatever's going on. And so our lifestyle is not built that way. So many people in this country, they don't even get off of work until late. They don't have time to prep for a healthy meal. They get home, they have XYZ number of stressors that they're walking into in their house. The last thing they can do is prep for a healthy meal and then go for a walk. They're like, it's 10 o'clock at night. What do you expect me to do? So we try and work on some ways to institute that as often as one can. And once you make room for that in your brain and you make it a priority, you can find those 10 minutes, right? We're not looking for an hour-long walk. It can be a 10-minute brisk walk. And really, depending on any kind of weather or whatever's going on, you can do that.
Yeah, there was a fascinating study I read the other day using the term exercise snacks. And they did it, I think, as low as 6 bouts during the day for 1 minute each of just going up and down the stairs. Right. So they didn't even have people go outside. Like if they have stairs in their house, walk up and down your stairs for 1 minute, do that 6 times a day. And these are in generally healthy people, not athletes, but they saw some pretty nice improvement in a fair amount of metrics with literally just 6 minutes a day. And it wasn't like high intensity training either. So I thought that was pretty fascinating.
Yeah, there was a study I saw back in, I think, March, and it was that same idea that 30 minutes broken up into 10-minute chunks throughout the day actually resulted in better glucose control than one single 30-minute exercise done and then being sedentary for the rest of the day. It's a case to be made. You don't have to work out and be crazy and carve out hours and hours at the gym. You just need to move around throughout your day, be more active.
Yeah, I remember talking to John Brady about this years ago because we were at a seminar and people were saying that, oh, but I have a desk job, but I exercise really hard for an hour a day. And he's like, exercise is definitely beneficial. You should try to get some other movement during the day. If we looked at your overall movement pattern during the day, it's not much. Huge spike, back to not much, not much, not much. And so now there's obviously a lot more emphasis on walking and getting step count and stuff, which is good.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's motivating. I think it is motivating. When you see that in your glucose monitor, it's really motivating to know that, okay, I can have a work lunch or I can enjoy the bagel that I used to love all the time or something, but I can go out for the sushi dinner that I love, but I know what to do to optimize it better in my body. I know that I need to build in that walk afterwards. I know I need to build in a strength training session before I go out to dinner, something like that, so that you're able to see exactly what happens to your body and how you can make it better.
Agreed. What do you see related to sleep, both acutely, since it's a continuous glucose monitor, we can get little snapshots during the night. We don't have to wake up and poke our finger, which is good, which you could say even potentially alters the data. I've tried that. I don't recommend it. What have you seen over the course of the night, both acutely and then thoughts about what you've seen chronically with sleep impacting blood glucose?
Yeah. So a couple things, right? Really poor choices for dinner can result in some poor sleep later on as the body, again, like I said, is processing either just higher loads of carbohydrate later in the day when, having a big dessert late at night, maybe after a couple of drinks and a higher carbohydrate meal can just send it high, keep it high. You can crash down and you can wake up. Then you might be really hungry. I've seen a lot of people wake up and they're like, I was starving, so I had to have something else to eat in the middle of the night. That then sends you up again and then down, right? It's very dysregulated. You're also waking up tired. And when you are waking up tired, how often do you want to go work out when you're super exhausted from a right? So just mentally, you don't want to make the healthier choices that your body frankly needs the next day. You are less sensitive to insulin the next day. So even a meal that you typically tolerate very well, you are spiking higher from, recovering slower from. So we definitely see that in the data. And sometimes that is one of those probing questions we ask. Again, one of those aha moments where someone says, I ate the same breakfast that I had yesterday. Why is my score on this meal so much worse? And I say, how did you sleep last night? They're like, oh, it's terrible. I was like, there you go. So there's the physiologic response to poor sleep. There's just the glucose response that can cause poor sleep. And it's really interesting. We actually just did a little lunch and learn internally about cortisol. It was glucose spikes at night and how they are related to cortisol and dreams or a dysregulation. It could be heat, temperature changes, things like that. So we were exploring all of those areas because we've all seen it in our members' data. Someone will say, I woke up in the middle of the night. Why did I was actually high? Some people say I woke up in the middle of the night and I crashed down low. So you can really see some different dysregulations and you probe a little bit more. Were you very hot? Were you cold? What did you have the night before to eat for dinner? And sometimes, honestly, it can be like a bad dream and a cortisol spike, which is a funky thing to see. So lots of different factors can impact sleep. And it's just more probing to figure out which one's, as you said, pulling the lever.
Got it. Very cool. What are your thoughts about, so this is what I've told people for experiments to do. And this was before you could get access to each meal. So this is generally my recommendation now, and I'd be curious on your thoughts is, in a perfect world, take 3 to 4, ideally 7 days. Let's say you have a monitor for 2 weeks. So take week 1, take 3, 4, maybe 5 days, 7 days if you can. Just do whatever you were doing. Train normal, do your sleep, do whatever. And my bias, although almost no one will do this now, is don't look at any of the data. Try to be blind to all the data, which drives them absolutely crazy. So I'm like, okay, let's just do 3 days or 4 days. I want to get at least a weekend. I want to get some cardio days. I want to get some strength training days. I want a work day and off day. And then after that period of time, just record everything you eat, put your little timestamp on it. And then we'll take a period of time, we'll unveil all the data and then look at it. And then the following week, look based on that data, what experiments do we want to run? Do you want to, let's say you love Pop-Tarts. So maybe you have Pop-Tarts first thing in the morning or after training or whatever your favorite food is, or something that looked a little bit funky in your data. Play with that more in isolation and then see if there's different things that can modify. What are your thoughts about that approach?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say I've only had a handful of members that have really taken a scientific approach about it. I had one guy who was like adamant to figure out what kind of pasta he could tolerate. So he would his exercise the same every morning. He would wait 2 hours without eating anything to be in a sort of fasted state. Then he would eat different kinds of pasta every morning. And then he would sit there. He would basically do his own like at-home glucose test. He would take
Yeah.
like grams of pasta every day.
Yep.
I will say not many people do that.
Yeah.
It's hard to do that. I agree. It's the same. It's the idea of let's get a baseline reading. Let's see how you're doing. And then what means the most to you in terms of your health goals? If you are looking to optimize your performance, okay, great. So we're going to test out various fuel sources, 15 minutes, an hour, whatever it is. And then let's test out what we're eating afterwards. Keep your exercise consistent. We're going to change your fuel sources. And again, it's just hard with people's lives, right? They're like, oh, I had a work dinner or out of town last minute. So that's why our programs, the shortest you can work with us is 1 month. So it's 2 sensors, because then at least we get a couple weeks worth of data, depending on all the different lifestyle factors. But I agree. Some people want to test those foods in isolation, like my guy with the pasta. He really just wants to see how his body handles pasta. But in my mind, that's not really real life. You're never just going to sit down to a bowl of pasta at 10 in the morning. So it's more interesting to see, okay, date night, and this is what you usually order on date night. So order that and do your regular day. Okay, this is where you are at baseline. Now let's do date night where you have some apple cider vinegar beforehand. Let's do date night where you eat the chips and salsa at the end of your meal and you start with a salad or even some protein first. Like let's live in the real world and make those real world adjustments to optimize your glucose. And so that's where it's more applicable to these people. And that's where they're going to then carry that behavior forward. They're not just going to eat pasta at 10 a.m.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And for the record, I get all the crazy clients, which I love, which is great. But same thing, right? So even if we test it in isolation, then the next step is, okay, when would you normally have this? What does that meal normally look like? And let's see if it still occurs then, right? Because most of them are like, I want to know which thing specifically it is. It's okay. We can test a complex meal, but we won't know what particular thing is in there if it gets wacky, but you can pull them out and then test them. But again, you're dealing with internal versus external validity, and one of them will answer the question of why, but it's not super practical. The other one's more practical, but for some people that doesn't give them the why, the detail that they really wanted, which you could argue may or may not matter. But so I agree. It's definitely an individual type thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned apple cider vinegar and the fancy word people throw around is like a glucose disposal agent, which these things have been around in especially bodybuilding folklore for decades. I remember people taking, was it vanadium sulfate and all sorts of crazy stuff, which potentially in high doses can be very toxic. But any thoughts on that kind of classification of compounds? What have you seen? Just, I'm always curious because does it even work? And then if it does work, what is the kind of mechanism?
Yeah. Apple cider vinegar, it can. It's not a silver bullet for everyone. So again,
This won't fix everything if I just douse all my food in and make it taste like crap.
I've had people that have taken it straight and they're like, I can't do that. I was like, I didn't want you to do that. Oh my God.
Yeah, it's not fun tasting.
Great. No, absolutely. I think it's again, it's N equals 1 for some people.
Right.
It makes a huge difference in their meal. Others, it doesn't. Right. And again, there could just be other factors at play. It's really hard to just say it's no Ozempic.
Right.
Not just going to lower you no matter what. So we see this with bitter melon. We see it with chromium. We see it with berberine. Some people respond really well to 500 milligrams of berberine before a meal. Some people don't. Some people respond to chromium. Some people don't. You have to remember to take it or have it with you if you're traveling or going out to eat. It's just another step that, do you have apple cider vinegar on you before you go out to dinner? Probably not. And you need to have it right before you eat. A lot of it's more sort of lifestyle changes and testing things out and saying, okay, if you love to have popcorn after dinner or something like that, okay, at least you're at home. Why don't we experiment with having something before that and see how your body responds to it? But let's also try something that you could do no matter what, like taking a walk afterwards. Does one respond better than the other? Do you just want to keep berberine in your car all the time?
Right.
There's a lot of different ways to go about it. I always get a little bit nervous about supplements because they are unregulated. I don't know how much berberine they say is in there is truly in there. You can get into that murky world of supplements. And some people just don't even want to take anything, or they're already taking so many, they don't want to take anything else. It's not a perfect system, but can be helpful.
Yeah, I agree. And obviously the supplement industry is regulated, but the issue of enforcement, and unfortunately, I would not take exactly what's on the bottle and assuming that it's in there from some very, unfortunately, shady companies. There's a study published the other day, and I didn't recognize a lot of the company brand, but some of them, unfortunately, have 1% of what was actually claimed to be on the bottle, like in there. So, unfortunately, it is not as good as what we would like it to be.
Yeah. And that's nothing against taking supplements.
No.
I think particularly when we have people that are following certain lifestyle diets and they are missing out on nutrients. And so you absolutely need that. The vegans need B12. Like you have to add things in at times. And there's nothing wrong with taking some zinc if you feel like you're coming down with something. None of this is bad. What is interesting is when we see people when they get those IV infusions. I don't know if you've ever seen that in any of your people's data, but super high doses of vitamin C can cause your to skyrocket. And so people are
yeah, it'll goof that sensor up like big time. And it'll scare the shit out of people.
They're like, am I dying? You're like, no, it's your IV infusion.
Yeah, that would be freaky because you're looking at it, you're like, oh my God, what the hell?
And it's a very narrow spike. The body, that's
like,
not thing that your body, it clears very quickly. Yeah.
Have you seen like sauna and cold water have any effects? So I did this a couple times, and I have a converted freezer I made into a cold water immersion, and I was pricking my finger before as I was getting in, and while I was in and while I was out, which wasn't really horribly hard to do. It was a little bit tricky. And again, N of 1. But my glucose would typically in the morning, this was all just done fasted, no exercise beforehand, like 85, 89, 87. And it would reliably drop into the 50s. Like I hit 55, 57. I didn't feel hypoglycemic at all. I felt perfectly fine. I don't know if you've seen weird stuff like that on more of the extreme ends.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not surprised to see something weird. And I'm assuming you probably recovered. I don't know if you took a finger stick like an hour or two later. Generally, these are very short term.
Oh, yeah, it was very short. Yeah,
Yeah.
like within, I don't remember. I think the longest I checked it later was 45 minutes, maybe an hour. And it was back to normal. It didn't stay for a long period of time. But yeah, I just thought that was interesting. It would drop that aggressively.
Yeah. I have a friend who wears one pretty religiously and he jumps in his freezing cold pool to see what happens. And his shoots high. His just
Really?
skyrockets. And that's
Interesting.
more of that stress effect as,
Uh,
oh my God, the body is like cortisol shock, releasing like large amounts of glucose because it's like, what's happening to me? A lot of times I think it depends on, I think of a sauna, it's almost that mental preparation. And I think sometimes when people do a cold plunge, I think it's almost, are you jumping into an ice cold pool or are you like sitting? It's almost like the stress going into it.
Mm.
Hyped up? Are you amped up? Are you like at a good steady state and you just ease yourself into it? The body can absolutely just like lower down. Or you hit it with that jolt and that spike, and you can see that. And with sauna as well, sometimes it can be very relaxing. I think for some people, they find it very relaxing. And so there's no cortisol response, and it can be an increase due to the temperature and the interstitial fluid, sort of the dehydration kind of factor, which you can see, and then the body comes back to normal. But I think it is interesting over time, you can see a lowered glucose, lowered average glucose. They're starting to show that in the research. It's not definitive, but I think some people will see it in the short term and it can be very helpful kind of in the short term, but generally over time, hot and cold therapy can be very helpful. It can also just reduce inflammation overall in your body. And when you have less inflammation, your body can handle glucose better. It all works together.
Yeah, and there's some very preliminary research on the metabolic effects of both heat and cold. And I have a guess that I think in the future we'll find that they are more beneficial on a metabolic health standpoint than what we probably realize now. That's my guess, but there's just not as much data on it. And I agree, it just depends also on adaptation. So I wasn't able to grab a sample like as soon as I got in because my hands were still doing weird stuff. Maybe I should grab a CGM and test it again. But I did it after I was in for 3 to 4 minutes at about 48 degrees. And this is after I had been doing it for probably around 6 months. So I was probably more adapted, more relaxed. But I could definitely see that when you get in initially, there's probably a huge spike too, because you've probably seen this data on people who exercise too. Like people are shocked that they're like, oh my God, my blood glucose went up. I'm exercising. I'm like, yeah, because you need some fuel in order to exercise. Your liver is going to dump out a bunch of blood glucose into your bloodstream. Like it's okay. Like you don't need to freak out about it.
100%. That's also one of the aha moments. People are like, wait, what? Why did my glucose go up when I was exercising? And we always say, what were you doing? And it's generally that anaerobic HIIT type workouts where the body just doesn't have enough to fuel the exercise. And so it pulls it out of storage. And people are like, oh my God, is that okay? It's like, yeah, absolutely. It's okay. You can play around with fueling. I think a lot of women tend to exercise fasted. And we encourage them to test something else out. Try and eat a little bit before you work out. Let's see how your energy levels. Can you work out harder, faster, stronger if you give yourself a little bit of fuel as opposed to hoping your body gives you enough in time?
And fascinating side note, the liver is actually under what's called a feed forward mechanism. So it'll actually dump out more than what it probably initially needs, where a lot of stuff is on a feedback mechanism where it's looking at different levels. Last question as we wrap up. What do you think is coming in the future? What would you, if you could design a sensor, would you want to see insulin levels? Would you want to see cortisol? Would you want to see, we've got a marker for glucose. I know some people I know have been testing the lactate and the ketone continuous monitors. Any thoughts on that and what you think might be sooner than later?
Absolutely. A continuous insulin monitor would be awesome for them.
Yeah.
And you could overlay ketones on it. And just a continuous C-reactive protein monitor to level your
Sure.
levels of inflammation would be incredible. I really hope access to all of this improves, be it the incredible things that just the Apple Watch has done, wearables, Garmin, just even having access to steps has really been helpful and motivating to a lot of people. I just think the more people that can get access to the data will have a better idea of what's actually going on in their body now, as opposed to going to their doctor one time a year and getting the news like, oh my gosh, you're pre-diabetic. It's like, what? When did that happen?
Yeah.
And the more that people can get an idea of what's happening in January, what's happening in April, what's happening in July, the better they will, the better motivated and the better in charge of their own health they will be. So I hope we can get more data, but I hope we can just get more people getting data to really help prevent the chronic diseases.
Yeah. Very last question. I just thought of one more quick one I wanted to get in is, have you seen any weird stuff with the use of like ketone salts or esters in terms of ketones as a supplement and the effect on blood glucose? What I've seen is that they do generally tend to lower blood glucose, at least is what I've seen on just anecdotal on a few individuals.
Yeah, I think it depends on when they're taking them. I've seen different
Yes.
things in the morning versus the afternoon. Some people will take them at night, which I don't really recommend. If we're seeing higher levels overnight, we'll play around with meal composition and meal timing before we would do anything like that. And again, it depends on what if they're taking them before a workout or versus some people take them if they're about to do a podcast or do
Sure.
have a stressful event or something like a presentation or something related to their work. So a little bit different in terms of like brain energy and the stress that overlays the glucose output in response to the ketones coming in. So yes, I've seen the decline. I've also seen the steady state. And then they say, I don't know if there was a real impact on it, but I say maybe it mitigated a spike that we just didn't see.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what's always hard because you're always looking at just the N of one and a snapshot in time too at that point.
Yeah, but to that point, I just encourage someone to do, let's do a 5-day test. If you can try and keep it scientific and take it at the same time every day, let's see how your body's responding to it on a more continuous basis.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you so much. Where can people find out more about Nutrisense and tell us more about everything you got going on?
Absolutely. I have been joking around lately. If you just say it 3 times, your phone will start sending you ads.
Oh, nice. To test it out.
They're all listening. You can find us on the web at www.nutrisense.io. And I encourage everyone to just check it out. We have an amazing blog. It's called The Journal. And all evidence-based, really fascinating bite-sized articles that can show you how this kind of technology can really improve all aspects of your health. So if you're on the fence, if you're not totally sure if this is the right tool for you, you can really see how applicable it is. And Nutrisense is pretty amazing because with your first month, you get dietitian support, nutritionist support. So you get someone along the way guiding you, showing you trends, showing you what's going on, helping you navigate, giving you ideas. So we think we're pretty special in that way. You're not out there on your own and you're not out there blind. You've got someone helping you out. So definitely check out our website. We're on all the social media avenues, Instagram at Nutrisense.io, and you can watch people putting on their monitors. You can watch people with all their different tests and stuff like that. It's super great. I encourage everyone to check it out.
Yeah, and I will say that I've had clients use your service before, and I've done it just without early on, just the old school, just stick monitors on them and you're managing it all. It is so much nicer to have someone else on the back end that I can refer them to and get their input because sometimes clients can drive you a little bit crazy with some of the questions. So it was nice to have an external expert being like, okay, let's look at this. And then obviously you guys look at data all the time and can come up with a game plan. And then I would go over it with them once a week or something. So it was super, super nice to have someone managing the day-to-day changes and looking at the data and making suggestions and then looking at it as an overview. So for trainers who are working with clients, like having someone else that helps with that whole process and that's all they do is extremely helpful also too.
Totally. Absolutely.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much for all your time today. I really appreciate it. This was super fun.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Huge thanks to Catherine for coming on here and sharing all the trends and everything she's seen from literally hundreds of thousands of hours of data. which is great. You get a snapshot of kind of a starting point of what to look for, which is awesome. I will put a link to their program and everything there. I don't have any disclosures with it. I didn't get paid anything to do this podcast. I don't make anything selling continuous glucose monitors or anything like that. But I think if they're done correctly, I do think they can be a good tool to use on occasion. I don't think you probably need to have one on for the rest of your life, but I do think it is a useful experiment to get an idea based on your physiology, what's going on. So thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Really appreciate it. If you want more podcasts, you can just go to my website, which is miketnelson.com/podcast. And then we'll have all the listings of all the podcasts we've done, including other guest episodes that I've done that don't show up on your podcast feed here. So go to miketnelson.com/podcast. And at the bottom, there'll be a way to get onto the newsletter. So that's the best place to get all content from me. I usually send out a newsletter once a day, trying to make them informative and entertaining at the same time. You can go to miketnelson.com/podcast, get on the newsletter, see all the old podcasts also. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And we will talk to all of you very soon.
Personally, I don't care for puppets much. I don't find them believable. I don't believe you.
This podcast is for informational purposes only. The podcast is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. You should not use the information on the podcast for diagnosing or treating a health problem or disease or prescribing any medication or other treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider before taking any medication or nutritional supplement, and with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this or any other podcast. Reliance on the podcast is solely at your own risk. Information provided on the podcast does not create a doctor-patient relationship between you and any of the health professionals affiliated with our podcast. Information and statements regarding dietary supplements are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to therein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician.